what's interesting is the more they do dig up the ground in, you know, the Middle East, in Israel and so on, the more they find that. So I just found actually something's happening in the culture. These interesting voices are coming out, suddenly realizing.
The Shroud of Turin has went mega viral again. What they're finding out, according to these studies, is that
it is a rather unique thing. What's even more fascinating is that when you do apply a kind of AI 3D filter to this thing, it's suddenly, I think Richard Dawkins still has a kind of fantasy that if we just push secular humanism a bit harder, everyone will come round to it. And a lot of people just assume this pool didn't exist, it was perhaps made up, because no one could found it. There was no evidence that this place existed until
Ruslan.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Today we have a special guest in the studio, all the way from across the pond. One of my favorite voices, one of my favorite creators in the space that's actually inspired me a lot, Justin Briley. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Man, so most people are probably familiar of you through the Unbelievable channel. You have hosted some epic debates on there, epic conversations. It started as a radio show, and it's evolved into kind of like a platform where all of these things were talked about. And you were kind of in the middle of this entire, I guess, cultural convergence of some of the new atheist remnants with Christians, and you've gone on to write a bunch of books, which we're going to discuss. But for people who may not be familiar, just give us a little bit about your background there and what you're doing now. We kind of get into maybe some of the transition as well.
Well, I guess I grew up in a Christian family. I kind of owned my faith for myself in my late teens. But by the time I'd kind of gone through university and was starting a career in radio journalism, particularly in the Christian world, I kind of wanted to find a way of creating better conversations between Christians and atheists. As you say, the early 2000s was a time when the new atheism was really gaining ahead of steam. You had these big names like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris writing these best-selling anti-God books. And so this was kind of where the cultural conversation was. And so I thought, well, maybe one way we could address this is by hosting conversations between Christians and atheists. So I started what was initially just a radio show in the UK called Unbelievable with a question mark. And I just brought into my studio Christians and atheists. We debated science, faith, ethics, history, all those things. And in the end, I guess what I was trying to do was kind of live out that verse in 1 Peter 3:15, which says, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And we were trying to create a kind of respectful atmosphere, but where we didn't pull our punches, where we had these significant debates. And that in time became a podcast. We were very early adopters of podcasting. And that kind of really took it to a different level. We suddenly started having people all over the world listening to these debates, especially in the US, and a lot of atheists, not just Christians. So it started to be really a diverse audience of both agnostics, atheists, and Christians who listened. And then obviously we got into video eventually. We started doing stuff in the video studio. We had conferences. I wrote a book about my experience doing the show and kind of my case for faith after about the 10-year mark of hosting these conversations. And it just had an enormous impact on my own journey, my faith. I kind of came to see that there were really good, compelling reasons to be a Christian. And I also developed a lot of friendships with atheists and agnostics along the way.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting that when you sit with the discussions, some people get threatened or think that they're going to walk away from the faith. But for me, it's always been reinvigorating that the more I hear the discussions, a lot of the stuff on your channel, the more I walk away with and go, oh man, like I have really good reasons to believe what I believe, and it reaffirms my faith. And that sounds like it's been an experience for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not that I've never been challenged, and there are things I've had to rethink, think through. There have been kind of some pretty compelling objections to faith that have been put there. And that, in a sense, the Unbelievable show was never kind of a safe kind of show in that sense, because you were genuinely bringing two cogent thinkers together to kind of debate this stuff. But I found that personally really, as you said, invigorating. I didn't want to run away from those questions. I wanted to encounter them. And I always found in the end that, yeah, I might have had to kind of think through things, rethink some of my ideas that I had around faith. But actually, in the end, I found Christianity tells a really compelling story of reality, a more compelling story in the end than I found atheism told. And for me, that's it. You'll never get a kind of bulletproof logical, irrefutable argument for God or faith. But what you do get is kind of good evidence, and you get kind of enough to make you think, actually, this makes sense. This is the best story of reality, and enough that I can actually put my faith in this. I can trust this, you know.
That's good. You have since moved on from Unbelievable, and you have your own YouTube channel. I also saw, was it a separate podcast that you're doing where you guys had Martin Shaw on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of podcasts I'm now contributing to. One's called Re-Enchanting, which is kind of a more of an interview style show that I host with someone else. But the big one that I'm working on at the moment is a documentary podcast series, and that's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, after my new book. And that's very different because that's really telling the story much more in a narrative way, with music, with lots of different, you know, talking heads and interviews and bits and pieces. So yeah, a lot of interesting guests on that, but really telling the story of how new atheism kind of rose and fell, but also the new conversation on God happening among lots of interesting secular thinkers and some interesting, really interesting new converts to Christianity as well.
Yeah. How was the transition from Unbelievable, which is kind of where people I've seen you most, and you're kind of ubiquitous in the Christian atheist debate space, and that kind of sunsetting, and you moving on to what you're doing now, and why the transition? It seems rather abrupt for someone like me, because I was watching you, I mean, almost everything you guys put out, and then when we met in person, you're kind of like, oh yeah, like I've since moved on, and we got to hang out last year at the O2 Arena and all that good stuff. So how was that transition?
It was tough. I won't, you know, beat about the bush there. It was, you know, I had, you know, poured 17 and a half years of my life into the Unbelievable show, and it was a kind of an amazing opportunity, and I kind of learned so much, I grew so much in the years of doing that show. So I owe so much to that experience of being able to do the show and everything. But you know, there's a time for everything, isn't there? And I just increasingly felt over the last few years that actually I'd kind of done everything I wanted to do through the Unbelievable show. It'd been a wonderful forum for engaging these debates and these discussions. But in the end, I felt actually I would be able to pursue some of the projects I wanted to do, new collaborations. It would be easy to do that independently, kind of in more of a freelance capacity. So in the end, it was a case of saying, actually, this was a wonderful sort of thing, something I will always treasure. And it was a very bittersweet goodbye. You know, when we kind of did my farewell show, we looked back on 17 and a half years of hosting all these amazing conversations. And yeah, it was a really emotional goodbye to a show I'd founded and loved. But also, there was a real sense of freedom, actually, in starting some new projects. And that was kind of scary, because I was completely moving from having essentially worked for an organization, Premier, my whole life. You know, that was a salaried job, obviously, to kind of just starting out fresh, you know, just trying to make a living, doing the independent journalism, podcasting thing. But God's been very good. And lots of people have come alongside who have helped to support me in that journey. We're seeing a lot of success, especially with this new podcast. A lot of people downloading it. We're able to kind of make a living from it, and I just love being able to tell the stories that I want to tell, you know, in different, fresh ways now. So there were a lot of things that came together. I mean, even COVID, you know, the lockdown and everything that happened in the UK had its part to play, because that meant I went from kind of being dependent on a radio studio and a video studio in central London to just doing everything from home. And I realized, actually, you can do this. You know, modern technology allows you to produce pretty good results just from your spare room. And so I realized, actually, you know what? I think I could do this without necessarily having to have a radio station behind me. And so it's proved, actually. I'm very grateful for all of that. But there's just this kind of, versatility now in terms of technology that allows you to do different things. And I just wanted to kind of step in and start to create content that I could own a bit more, that I could put my own stamp on a little bit more. And you know, people have midlife crises. I guess I had mine around the age of 40. And I just wanted to kind of think, I was having that thought, do I want the next 40 years of my life to look like what I've already done? And I thought, you know what, actually, I think there's some new things I need to do. And it's going to be a scary step, but let's do it.
What has been the most interesting, challenging, exciting part about going from working for a radio station and being more or less an employee to now being an entrepreneur and running your own organizations? I
mean, the thing I love most about it is just being completely in control of my own diary. Now, obviously, I can still overfill it and get stressed if I do try to do too much, but it's that sense of actually everything I'm doing today is because I've decided this is what I want to do with my day and what I feel God is, well, hopefully what I feel God is calling me to do. So there's a sense in which there's just a liberation there, and it's wonderful to be able to have that. I mean, not everyone can have that, and that's just different types of jobs and everything else, but it's a wonderful feeling of liberation, freedom to pursue the thing that I really feel I'm being asked to do. So that's kind of probably the major thing that I feel, but also the freedom to just collaborate more freely with other people, to come and do this with you, to be able to kind of make new friendships, just dream really, imagine projects that perhaps I wouldn't have been able to do when I was kind of sitting within a kind of another infrastructure. And so for me, it's kind of like I've had so many conversations over the last year, 18 months, where there's all kinds of possibilities on the horizon that weren't there before. And I really love that. It just really fires me up.
That's awesome. That's awesome. When we met, you gave me your latest book, which is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And what I loved about the conversation you're continuing to have is I feel like a lot of the stuff we've been talking about on my channel has been kind of connecting the dots of, hey, there's the Jordan Petersons, the Joe Rogans, all these different folks who seem to be coming back to a Christian biblical worldview. And you've been on the cutting edge of talking about that in this book, but I kind of feel like for a while, right?
Well, when we met, you had just been at the ARC conference.
That's right.
And you told me, I remember, hey, I just saw Azerbaijan on stage, and she seems to be talking in really Christian terms. And then, of course, just a week or so later, she publishes this viral article, Why I Am Now a Christian. So we were already kind of seeing a lot of the similar stuff, I think.
And subsequently, she then sat down with Richard Dawkins, who still thought that it was like, oh, you're a cultural Christian like I am. And she's like, no, like I really believe this stuff. Which was a bombshell, considering that she was a part, or almost a part of, like the four horsemen of the new atheism, and now she's took the reversible jersey on and now is a Christian.
It's amazing. I mean, when I saw that happen, I mean, it kind of was like a validation of the thesis of the book. Because I'd obviously published the book, and you publish a book, and you kind of it's how the land lies at that point. And then just a couple of months though after I published the book, Azerbaijan comes out with this viral article and says, I'm now a Christian. And as you say, the most famous female atheist in the world, arguably, you know, raised in fundamentalist Islam in Somalia, came out of that, completely rejected it when she fled to Europe from a forced marriage, became completely, you know, absolutely anti-religious, wrote a best-selling anti-God book, shared all those stages with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, all the new atheists. So she was the last person I was expecting to see this happen to. And yet there it was. And the reasons kind of just mirrored so closely what I was seeing across the rest of culture, this failure of new atheism to actually give people an existential reason for living. And secondly, just the acknowledgement that actually we need something like the Christian story to make sense of life. And that actually a real concern about where the West is going in the absence of any story that can make sense of life.
Okay, so you said you were seeing this across culture. I was seeing this more in the podcast space and the media space. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Which aspects of culture were you seeing this shift happening?
Well, I'd been hosting conversations on faith for, you know, getting on for 10 or 15 years at this point. And as I say, it had really been in the crucible of the new atheist way of doing debates, these very high-octane debates about God and science and so on, with these big characters like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens at the forefront of that. And these were very bombastic characters, and so we tended to have these very dramatic debates where it was, you know, God versus atheism, science versus faith. And so that was kind of the way in which kind of the cultural conversation on faith was happening for a number of years, and when I started my Unbelievable show. But I noticed a significant change over the years in the tone of the conversation. So I think I noticed a significant change around 2017, 2018. And suddenly I started to hear it a lot more from secular thinkers, but who were far more open to the value of Christianity. And they were kind of distancing themselves from the Richard Dawkins kind of stuff. I met a lot more atheists who were telling me when they came to my studio, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, basically. I'm not just going to dismiss and ridicule religion, basically. And so I was interested to see this change happening. And at the same time, I noticed the rise of some really significant personalities. And people started emailing me about this guy, Jordan Peterson, and this kind of slightly eccentric Canadian psychology professor, but who was attracting thousands of people, especially young men, to like 3-hour lectures on the book of Genesis. And I was like, that's weird. What's going on there? And what I noticed is that essentially he was drawing the same audience who had been turning up for Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris in the New Atheists. And I realized something was happening in the culture. He was scratching an itch, this kind of existential question that kind of hadn't ultimately been answered by the New Atheists. People were still looking for meaning, for purpose, for identity. And where was he pointing them? He was pointing them back to the Bible. And so I was fascinated to see that. I managed to get Jordan Peterson on my show, kind of, you know, around the time he was really blowing up. And it was just fascinating to see him filling these stadiums and eventually having these debates with some of the New Atheists like Sam Harris. And it wasn't just him. I just noticed other people coming out the woodwork. There's a well-known kind of cultural commentator called Douglas Murray in the UK. You may be familiar with him. But again, he was kind of, he had his New Atheist phase. But by the time I spoke to him in sort of 2021, 2022, was having him on my show a couple of times, he was describing himself very differently. He was describing himself as a Christian atheist.
Yes.
And that sounds like a contradiction in terms, obviously. Yes. But what he meant by that was that, yeah, he didn't believe in Christianity, but he still kind of understood that he had been completely shaped by Christianity. All his beliefs about human dignity and value and equality, and just essentially his belief in Western values kind of came out of Christianity. He realized they didn't come from atheism. They didn't come from science. They didn't come from sort of any other ancient history. So he was significant. And then, of course, there was the Tom Holland effect. This was not the Spider-Man actor. This was the historian. And I got to know him kind of before he blew up as well. But Tom Holland probably hosts the best-known history podcast in the world. The rest is history. He's written a best-selling book called Dominion. And it's all about the way the Christian Revolution completely shaped the way we think about what it is to be human in the West, our moral instincts, essentially. And I just, when I first had him on, he kind of told me about how he himself had kind of had a kind of vague awareness of faith growing up, but it had kind of fizzled out by his teenage years. And he was a happy secular person. And after university, went on this great popular career writing popular historical books about the Greeks and the Romans, but how he came to realize as he stood in their sandals to research these books, how very different their world was and the values they held. Because this was a world where slavery was an absolutely de facto part of the economy, a world where the lives of women and children were cheap, where some people could be the sexual property of other people. And he said, he asked himself, why do I believe in equality, dignity, compassion, freedom, progress? And he realized it wasn't because of the Greeks and the Romans. It didn't come from them. He realized it didn't come from science or atheism or the Enlightenment. He found actually all of those things actually stood downstream from where these values did come from. And it was the person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth and the movement that came out of the claim of his life, death, and resurrection, which completely reshaped the world that you and I are now sitting in, to the extent that people don't even realize how much their basic assumptions about morality are completely Christian.
How much they're borrowing from God.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this was what Tom Holland realized. He said to me in an interview, he said, although I struggle to believe in the claims of Christianity, I realized that in almost every other way, I am a Christian. And he just became this fantastically interesting voice, having these conversations with his secular peers. And again, it was just another really interesting way in which the conversation was changing dramatically. And I just started to take notice of this, and I started to have more of these folks come on, not as Christians, but kind of in a strange way defending the Christian view of reality. So I had Jordan Peterson come on and debate an atheist psychologist. Now, you know, I asked Jordan Peterson, well, do you believe in God? And he kind of gave his usual, well, it depends what you mean by God.
What do you mean by mean?
Yes, exactly. But it was so fascinating because you could have mistaken him if you'd just been listening casually as a Christian apologist. Likewise with Tom Holland, likewise with Douglas Murray. So I just found actually something's happening in the culture. These interesting voices are coming out, suddenly realizing
the Occupy Till I Come collection is here at the Blessed God Shop, and it is inspired by Luke chapter 19 and Jesus' parable of the 10 servants. And he called his 10 servants and delivered to them 10 pounds and said unto them, Occupy Till I Come. It's a powerful reminder for us to live with purpose, using our time, talent, and resources to glorify God until Jesus returns. This piece of art is made up of beautiful iconography, telling the story of sowing and reaping, dying to sin, and evangelizing the lost. And when you put on one of the pieces from this collection, it's a constant reminder that we are here to not just sit back and be apathetic, but to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to help usher in God's kingdom on this side of eternity and to care for the least of these. But this entire collection is only available until September 8th at midnight. So go to blessgod.shop and get yours now.
Atheism didn't give us the answers we need. And actually, it turns out we're losing an awful lot potentially by simply ignoring or dismissing the Christian story.
I want to come back to how much is being lost in the UK by moving away from the Christian story in a moment. You mentioned Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, obviously Richard Dawkins. So Douglas Murray, Christian atheist. Richard Dawkins, cultural Christian.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Do you think those are cop-outs? Because everybody wants the fruits of Christianity, especially when you remove it, and then that something fills that void, which again we'll get into later, right? Something is, especially in the UK. So we've gotten rid of it, and now something's filled that void. Yeah. And Richard Dawkins isn't like that. And you know, Douglas Murray, I'm an atheist, Christian atheist, whatever he wants to call himself. Are these just cop-outs? You're wanting the fruits of a Christian society and civilization, but you're afraid to acknowledge that there may be something to the roots of the claims of the Christian story.
I think that's one way of putting it. Arguably, it is a cop-out. I think in Richard Dawkins' case, when he came out at Easter talking about being a cultural Christian, and he has said that before, but the point is he was doing it because, as you say, he's scared of what will fill the void. I think a lot of new atheists are now realizing that by kind of trying to sweep the floor clean of the Christian story, they weren't making way for this utopia of science and reason that they all hoped would emerge, but actually all these other beliefs have suddenly crowded in, whether from the kind of the woke left or the fundamentalist right or the Islamic ideology or whatever. And that's obviously what Richard Dawkins is fearful of. And he realizes actually maybe we were better off with the kind of cultural Christianity I'm happy with, that does encourage tolerance and you know, has given us beautiful cathedrals and nice things like carol services. Of course, my problem with Richard Dawkins' love of being a cultural Christian is that, well, the fact that you've been trying to eradicate Christianity means that any cultural Christianity will inevitably disappear.
Yeah, thanks to you, Mr. Dawkins.
Exactly. It's a very kind of, it's a very contradictory thing that he's saying here. Right. You know, if we don't have any more Christians, you won't have any more cathedrals or nice carols at Christmas. So the point is, yeah, you will not have those fruits if you cut off the roots. Right. Okay. This is what Ayaan Hirsi Ali has realized. She's realized actually, you're not going to have these nice things, these values, if we've completely forgotten the story and we no longer believe it. Now, I think Douglas Murray is a bit different to Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins kind of, to the extent to which he appreciates Christianity, it's purely as a kind of, well, it might be a useful fiction that's helpful for some people. And to that extent, I'm going to give it some lip service. Douglas Murray, I find, is far more of a kind of wistful agnostic. He really wishes it were true. He wishes he could believe it, almost. That's the sense I've had in the conversations I've had with Douglas. He totally understands that atheism, secular humanism, will not get you the world that you want. I think Richard Dawkins still has a kind of fantasy that if we just push secular humanism a bit harder, everyone will come round to it. And that's not going to happen. It's just not a story anyone's interested. It's just such a boring story. No one's going to actually feel like they want to buy into that. I think Douglas Murray recognizes that. He recognizes we're story-driven creatures. Yes. I think he has a metaphysical problem with Christianity. He struggles with just the historical claims around Jesus and his resurrection. So I think that would be a fascinating conversation to have with him, because I just feel like he does get that the secular story of reality isn't going to wash it. We need Christianity. He knows we need Christianity. It's just he personally struggles with whether he could be a Christian. But I think he's actually really attracted to that. A bit like Richard Dawkins, he loves being in church, certain types of churches. He loves the mystery and the awe. He loves the Christian poets and literature. You know, these are all the things that kind of make life worth living. But he struggles with whether Jesus was who he said he was, whether he lived, died, and rose again. So I think someone needs to kind of have that conversation with Douglas Murray at some point. But that'll be a challenge because there's obviously things about Douglas Murray's own life that will be challenged by a thoroughgoing Christian faith.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, with Holland, where would you say he's landed at? Is he closer to Jordan Peterson? And we'll get more into where Jordan Peterson seems to be. Or is he closer to a Douglas Murray or Richard Dawkins?
I'd say Tom Holland is actually beyond both Dawkins and Douglas Murray. And I think he finds Jordan Peterson a bit of a puzzle, frankly. He's a bit confused by Jordan Peterson. He's been on record in my most recent conversation with him. I shared a live dialogue with him in London, of being just explaining how at an intellectual level, he's convinced that the Judeo-Christian story has completely shaped the world, obviously, but he's also become very attracted to it at a personal level. And it was in the process of kind of reading all the great church fathers and theologians and sort of investigating the history that he came to just really love this story. He found it fired him in a way that the kind of, as I say, the secular humanist story just felt drab and pallid in comparison to this amazing story of a God who comes in person and transforms the world through his son. He finds that really engaging. He loves the story. But for him, it's like he struggles to kind of believe it just at an intellectual level. And he says that actually it's often when he kind of doesn't discard the intellectual, but he kind of transcends it when he's in church. When he attends church, he attends the oldest church in London, 900 years old, St. Bartholomew the Great. It's full of ritual and mystery, beautiful choral music. And he says when he's there, he finds he can believe it. He finds that there's something like happens in his brain where it's like, no, this makes sense. This makes sense. It's kind of when he kind of tries to over-rationalize it almost, that he then struggles almost. But Tom Holland is someone who effectively, and I think he said this himself really, he's basically there, okay? He'd much rather this story be true than it wasn't true. He went on record, interestingly, in this conversation, at a very personal level, talking about kind of some, what he sees as miraculous events in his life as well, that for him have kind of taken him to the very edge of belief. One of these a few years ago was when he was in northern Iraq doing a TV documentary on ISIS. And he was kind of walking through this bombed out town called Sinjar. Just awful. This was a place where women had been raped, their daughters shot, the men crucified. And he ended up in this church, which had been completely desecrated by ISIS. And he found in the rubble a picture of the angel Gabriel coming to the Virgin Mary, the Annunciation. And he says maybe it was a mixture of dehydration and nausea or whatever, but he said it just felt like a thin place where suddenly angels exist, God exists, this story is true. And he says he couldn't shake that feeling. Even when he came home and kind of, you know, things got back to normal, he couldn't shake the memory that something had happened in that place. And then more recently, while kind of there was a surge of kind of COVID in the UK and the hospitals were kind of being overrun, he got this shock diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, bowel cancer. And he talked very candidly about just, he was in turmoil about this, but he couldn't get any answers. And he didn't know what to do. And this happened around Christmas time. And so he went to midnight mass at the church he sometimes attends. And it's a very high church, and it happens to be, this is the interesting thing about the story, the one church in London where supposedly the Virgin Mary appeared to the monks, like in the 1200s. So they have a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And he says he went kind of as an agnostic, but after the service ended, he thought, you know what, I could just try praying about this. So he went to the chapel and he prayed. Interestingly, he prayed to Mary, of all things. And he says within a couple of weeks, lots of unusual things happened that meant that he came back with a diagnosis that was completely cancer-free and clear. And he said, like, he kind of had to laugh because he thought this is the least likely way that I thought God would kind of become real for me.
Within weeks? So
within a few weeks,
he couldn't have gotten chemo that fast.
No. So what it was, I think, was that he was looking to get another diagnosis. He was looking for someone to kind of give him a second opinion on this. And it worked out in various ways that he was able to get a better understanding of what was going on inside. And he was able to see that actually what they had actually seen on this scan was actually not the type of cancer that they thought it was. In fact, it was this benign thing. And in fact, he was going to be clear. But it was kind of like he said, the circumstances that led to him being able to get that were very unusual.
Interesting.
So anyway, he saw this as an answer to prayer. And he says kind of, you know, it made him laugh because, you know, he never expected to kind of come from this kind of desperate atheist prayer to Mary of all things, but it's kind of led him down the road to thinking, actually, maybe this is true. Maybe this isn't just an intellectual thing. And I don't know quite what to do with that story because I'm not into the whole Mary thing myself. I don't know if you are, Ruslan, but
I'm not. I mean, all props to Mary.
Yeah,
but I'm not like that.
But I guess I kind of take the view that, look, God can deal with people however wonky we may think their theology is. Actually, God is a God of grace. And I think Tom Holland has just been experiencing the grace of God in various ways.
Wow.
And so I find that he's definitely, I don't know exactly where he is on the journey, but I know that he's he goes to church, he wants to believe, and I think a lot of the time he does believe.
So all of these folks that you're describing, we've talked about Richard Dawkins, cultural Christian, Douglas Murray, Christian atheist, Tom Holland, who seems way closer to where Jordan Peterson is, right? There's this need to rationalize and to intellectualize and to have a form of evidence, right? Now, I think evidence is a loaded term because the only real way to prove the resurrection is with a time machine and a video camera, right? Which is what something Alex O'Connor posed to Jordan Peterson, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But this week, the Shroud of Turin has went mega viral again, right? And what they're finding out, according to these studies, is that the initial 1980 study that they took a sample and they carbon dated it back to the medieval phase. One was a flawed study. Two was probably taken of a piece that was fixed, that was burnt up in fire. It was like
a patch up of it from the fire.
Yeah. So they're finding that the 1980s study is inconclusive and false. And the new studies that they've done has actually traced it back to the time of Jesus in the region.
The first century.
To the first century. With the seemingly exact marks and injuries that Jesus had. But even better to that, the part that I think is mind-bending that I haven't heard a single explanation from is the photo-negative print on this shroud that is you can't replicate it. We don't know how we got it. It makes no sense. Could this Shroud of Turin, now that it's looking like it goes back to the time of Jesus, to the region of Jesus, to the wounds of Jesus, and with the technology that doesn't exist now, can't be replicated, this art can't be replicated, is this as close, do you think, we'll get to the evidence for the resurrection, right? Because if it's a negative of a light beam coming out, the resurrection clearly is an explanation for how this can get made if there's no other way for it to be recreated. So what do you think of all that? And could this be, if the consensus is this is definitely from the region of Jesus, it definitely is the time of Jesus, it definitely has the marks of a crucifixion, and the only way this negative could be made is with the technology that does not exist, and therefore the resurrection is a reasonable explanation. Could this be the evidence that some of these guys need to tip them over from this agnosticism or whatever it is that they have to a full-on theistic view of Jesus?
It could be. It could be. It'll depend on the person in the end. I mean, I, several years ago, did a whole radio documentary on the Shroud of Turin. And I approached that myself as pretty much a skeptic because I'd kind of read all the stuff that, oh, well, people have carbon dated it, and it
mainline scientific consensus on it.
What I'd heard was just, oh, it's probably a forgery. And when I actually went and spoke to people, the Shroudies, as they're called, the people who really have invested their life in investigating this, I discovered, there's a lot more interesting stuff that you don't necessarily always hear in the mainstream kind of coverage of this. And it is this stuff about the fact that, it turns out the radiocarbon dating looks like it took a patch that was actually just a stitch up, just a repair in the medieval times. And so we don't know necessarily. And now this new study seems to show actually it does date back to the 1st century, this piece of cloth. But yeah, the most interesting thing about the shroud, as you say, was the nature of the print that's on it. It's almost impossible to conceive how that could have been a forgery, because now we don't have the means to create that kind of a print. It's only a few microns thick, this photonegative image. You know, people have said maybe someone painted it on, maybe it was left to bleach. None of those kind of naturalistic ways in which people tried to explain the shroud seem to work. We can't do it today, let alone back in medieval times. And so it looks like there's something really weird going on with this. It is rather a unique thing. And what's even more fascinating is that when you do kind of apply a kind of AI 3D filter to this thing, it's suddenly, it's not just that it kind of looks like the photonegative of a crucified man. It's that if that sort of was imprinted on this cloth through some kind of burst of radiation or whatever, it looks just like a 3D mold of a face would come out. It's it's got all these kind of fascinating layers which seem to suggest something interesting to go on. So I kind of went from being agnostic, skeptic about it, to like, okay, there's more to this than I thought. And one of the people I interviewed about it, who's a kind of physicist himself and has done a lot of research on the shroud, he said it's a kind of, for some people, this will be the thing that kind of brings together science and evidence and the historicity of Jesus and the resurrection. And it's this meeting place of science and faith, basically, on this shroud, which will be enough for some people. And I do know for some people, it's been the kind of missing piece that kind of made them think, you know what, I can take this seriously. Now, I don't want to say our faith in the resurrection is based on the veracity of this item, okay? And of course, there are lots of things about the shroud that I'm not so keen on. I don't want anyone to be venerating and kind of in any way worshipping a piece of cloth, okay? But I do think it's a fascinating garment, a fascinating thing. And I do think increasingly the evidence seems to be tying it back to that empty grave. But I'm not going to base my faith in the resurrection on that alone, okay? Because I think actually we've been blessed with lots of evidence for the resurrection, historical evidence. You know, the first place I want to turn for evidence for the resurrection is the accounts written down, you know, in the 1st century by the first followers of Jesus. That was a crazy claim for God-fearing Jewish people to be making, that the Jewish Messiah had both been crucified and been resurrected. They had to have a good reason for saying such crazy stuff that eventually got them persecuted and killed. And there were all kinds of other factors around this that point to the truth of this claim they were making. Lots of interesting historical features of their testimony, of what was happening at the time, just the explosive growth of the early church. There's a kind of resurrection-shaped hole at the center of that. So for me, you know, I'm going to be looking at the big picture, and I'm going to say how interesting that this item also seems to fit really well. And it's just another piece. It's kind of, so it's cumulative for me. I'm not going to say it's all down to whether this item can be dated back to the 1st century or not. But for me, it's just another piece of evidence that says, actually, if you're willing to suspend your materialistic
presuppositions
that miracles just don't happen.
Yes.
Because in that case, there's no amount of evidence. If that's your worldview, if you say miracles do not happen, then there is no amount of evidence I could give you that would make you believe Jesus came back to life. Even a video recording, you just say, well, someone created it, you know.
It's a deep fake.
It's a deep fake.
It's AI. Yeah.
Because if you're committed to the idea that miracles don't happen, then no evidence will shake you from that. There's always going to be a naturalistic explanation you're going to reach for.
Yes.
But if you're willing to suspend that, okay, or even just question that presupposition, it turns out that the resurrection is a fantastic explanation for a whole range of different things. Not just historical evidence, not just the Shroud of Turin, the changed lives of millions of people around the world. That itself is a remarkable piece of evidence for the truth of this story. So for me, I love the Turin Shroud. It's fascinating. I want to investigate more. I think there's a real connection now that's being established between it and the events. But I don't want to just say that's it. I think we are given a plethora of evidence, and we've never lived at a time with more reasons to believe in Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah. What if you get a moment to sit down and pitch your best argument for the resurrection to someone that's struggling with it, right? Tom Holland, fill in, and a lot of these guys probably already know some of the best arguments. Outside of the Shroud of Turin, you said the historical evidence based on the New Testament. Is that where you would kind of plant your flag and say, I'm going to make a case for this?
I'd give maybe 5 core reasons.
Okay.
And what's interesting about these 5 reasons, not everyone likes this approach, but I like this approach. They're 5 kind of pieces of historical evidence that are essentially agreed upon by the majority of historians of the era, whether they're believing or not. Okay, so this isn't dependent on you being a Christian, believing in the authority of Scripture. These are just kind of what historians of the era believe about the events. Firstly, that Jesus Christ died of crucifixion. Okay, that is just one of the best established facts of ancient history. Secondly, that his empty tomb was discovered by a group of his female followers. That is a well-established fact, partly because the Gospels tell us it was women who discovered the empty tomb. If you were fabricating a story, you would not put women as the first discoverers of the tomb in that culture, because the testimony of a woman was worth far less than that of a man. If you were trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, you would have put men at the scene, but they say it was women. That didn't help their cause then. It helps their cause now, interestingly, because we realize people wouldn't have made that up. It's sometimes called the criterion of embarrassment. If it was kind of embarrassing for someone to say back then, it's probably more likely to be true, because you don't say stuff that embarrasses you. So it seems like a well-established fact that there was an empty tomb discovered by his female followers. Thirdly, that there were people experienced what they believe were the experiences of the resurrected Christ. So we have the stories of Jesus appearing to Peter and James and to Paul on the road to Damascus. And again, these are generally accepted by the wide majority of scholars. So, for instance, Bart Ehrman, very critical New Testament scholar, not a Christian, but even he says, yeah, the disciples had experiences that they believed were of the risen Christ. Okay, now, he may have a different interpretation of what they're actually experiencing, but he doesn't deny that the best historical understanding we have is that they did experience something. Okay. Fact number 4, people converted. People who had no reason to want to join this Christian movement became followers of Jesus. People like James, the brother of Jesus, who was not a fan of the movement to begin with. Paul, who was going around persecuting Christians, had this extraordinary conversion. Something has to happen for people to have that kind of about turn. Okay, so that's another interesting fact you've got to put in there. Again, the vast majority of historians say this happened. Okay, people change. And fifthly, the explosion, the growth of the early Christian church. This was a movement of kind of people who should have been dejected, defeated disciples. They'd just had their leader snuffed out by the Roman authorities. What happens in that case? People who believe they've had the Messiah and they met a grisly death from the Roman authorities, they always went and found a different Messiah. There were other movements going on at that time, people thinking they'd found the one, and then he gets killed, executed, they go and find another one. What they never did was claim that their Messiah had come back to life, because that was not part of their theological expectations. There was a theological expectation in Judaism of an end time resurrection, but not of the resurrection of the Messiah in time. So this was a completely strange, novel
concept.
Foreign concept. It would have been a weird one for people to have just invented on the fly, and yet they go around and start proclaiming this, and they're willing to suffer beating, persecution, and death for this claim, and the movement explodes. These 5 facts, I think you can kind of try and give them a naturalistic explanation. You can try and come up with all kinds of things. Maybe someone stole a body. Maybe, they just invented
Twin brother.
Yeah. All there's lots of options. But I think when you run all of those kind of naturalistic explanations through the filter of those 5 facts, none of them really make sense of them all. Okay. What if the explanation that was first given by the followers, Jesus had been raised from the dead, well, that kind of fits them all perfectly. And what if we can just, as I say, if we're willing to suspend our, this inherent materialistic assumption we often bring that miracles don't happen. And if you think about it, if there's one candidate for whom this kind of a miracle might have happened to, it might just be the person who's had the most outsized impact on the world ever, who it appears from scriptures was predicted to do the things he did, and to die, and even to rise again. It feels like lots of things point to this person as being, if there was going to be one candidate to whom this would happen, one miracle, at least in history, it would be Jesus of Nazareth. So I think there's all kinds of interesting historical evidence that actually makes sense.
Yes.
It makes sense to believe. Now, this may not convince everyone. You know, some people's kind of levels of evidence that they need seem to be so sky high that even this will not move the dial for them. In the end, that's more about that person than I think it's about the evidence. I think it's some people's kind of skeptometer is dialed so high, like no amount of evidence, you know, even, you know, Alex O'Connor's video of the resurrection would persuade them. But that's ultimately between them and God and what's holding them back. I think there's enough evidence for someone who's a willing, rational, reasonable person to say, yep, something happened.
More likely than not, something happened. There's enough there
Yeah.
of a confidence
Yeah.
spectrum that we could say, I think there's something that here. And then if I trust in this, then I can trust in the words of Jesus and the ways of Jesus. If I trust in the ways of Jesus, all of a sudden my life is transformed.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't want to pretend that just giving you 5 evidences for the resurrection kind of makes you a believer, gives you a relationship with God. But it might be the missing piece of the intellectual puzzle that allows someone to then do what faith actually is, which is trusting in Jesus.
Yeah.
You can believe that Jesus rose again.
You could believe the FAQs.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not the same as having an encounter.
That's not the same as having faith or trust, because there's an analogy I like to use about this. There was this famous tightrope walker in the 19th century called Blondini who had this act of crossing Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And one day the King of England came to see his act at Niagara Falls. And so he watched Blondini cross the Niagara Falls on the tightrope, and then he took a wheelbarrow and he pushed a wheelbarrow back and forth. And then he put a sack of potatoes in the wheelbarrow, went back and forth on the tightrope. And he came to the King of England and he said, "Do you believe that I could put a man in this wheelbarrow and wheel him back and forth across Niagara Falls?" And the king said, "Of course I believe that." And he said, "Well, get in then." And that's the difference between believing something and actually trusting, having faith. It's putting your life on the line. It's putting your life on that belief. It's leaning into it. And so for me, you can believe in the resurrection. Even the demons believe and tremble, James says. It's whether you're willing to actually invest something. Will you trust your life to this idea?
And I will say that all of this is much more compelling coming from someone with an amazing British accent as yours. I'd say all the same thing and it wouldn't sound as eloquent. Okay, so one of the things that we were just talking about were the 5 facts of the resurrection, Shroud of Turin. Is there any archaeological evidence that you could think of that proves an aspect of the biblical narrative to be true or confirms something regarding Jesus and the early church that comes to mind as like a hard piece of evidence?
Yeah, I mean, this is the fascinating thing about archaeology is you only have just a fragment of what was around in ancient times.
Sure.
Okay, and the things that tend to get left behind are the things that survive, like coins. Okay, statues, maybe. You don't like stuff that's written down on papyrus that quickly evaporates. Buildings get demolished. You know, it's actually surprising how little we can actually get up from the ground very often. And most of what you get simply is a reminder of the most significant figures of the time, the most powerful figures of the time. You know, the Caesars, the emperors, they're the ones who had the statues and whose faces were on the coins and that kind of thing. So the fact we've almost got anything really that corroborates the biblical story is in itself a kind of a mini miracle, because Jesus was not a emperor or a Caesar or a kind of military commander. He was kind of this, in the eyes of the Roman Empire, this nobody from the back of nowhere. Okay, and yet we have, firstly, obviously, 4 Gospels, which have survived remarkably, and which and that's the first thing to say is just the Gospels themselves and the writings of the early church. They are such a good evidence of the historicity of this story, because we have more of them dating back earlier than almost any other kind of writings we have for other ancient figures. So that's really important to recognize. It's not just archaeology, it's kind of the written accounts. And that in itself is kind of a miracle, that we've just got such an abundance of evidence for the story of Jesus in the Gospels, in the early writings of Paul and elsewhere. But yeah, in terms of the actual archaeology, the stuff you can dig out of the ground, what's interesting is the more they do dig up the ground in, the Middle East, in Israel and so on, the more they find that things that they once thought sort of couldn't be corroborated or were maybe even made up in the Gospels or in the Bible, it turns out that there's something that makes sense of it. So I'm thinking of, like, you know, a lot of people have questioned whether the accounts of Jesus's birth are reliable because there's accounts of him being born under a particular governor, and people look at this and say, oh, they must have got this wrong because it's the wrong time. Well, it turns out they now discover that there is actually a kind of headstone that it turns out has the same name of the governor. There's might have been two governors with the same name. You get all of that stuff happening all the time. Every time that there's a kind of, you know, people make an assumption, I find that, oh, the Bible got it wrong. You frequently find when you do uncover evidence, it turns out, they knew more than we know. It turns out there's something. So that kind of stuff is happening all the time. I mean, one great example of this that I talk about in my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is the Pool of Siloam. So this is comes up in John chapter 9, and it's the story of Jesus healing a man. And it's at this pool, it takes place at this pool where people went to bathe in the waters because they thought it had these kind of healing properties and so on. And a lot of people just assumed this pool didn't exist. It was perhaps made up in the book of John because no one could found it. There was no evidence that this place existed until just a few years ago when they were kind of doing some excavations in Jerusalem, and suddenly they found this ancient pool and they got it excavated, and they did an analysis and they looked at some of the coins that were in the plaster, and these were coins that dated to just before and just after the time when Jesus would have been alive and in his ministry. So it dates to the exact time when Jesus was doing his ministry. It makes perfect sense of the story. It's suddenly the Pool of Siloam exists, and suddenly the skeptics who said, "Oh, this was just fabricated. This was just a theological invention." Hey, it turns out there's a Pool of Siloam. So these kinds of things happen surprisingly, and it's not that therefore tells you this story definitely happened, but it corroborates the story, and that's the point. And we're never going to kind of, in a sense, have the kind of archaeological evidence that says Jesus definitely healed this person, this thing definitely happened. But what you have is every time we do uncover archaeology, it corroborates, it supports the general thesis. And that's true of even things like, you know, a lot of people were skeptical of the idea that Jesus preached in the synagogue, for instance, in Nazareth. They said at the time, Nazareth didn't have a synagogue. This must have just been made up later by some writers. Hey, archaeological evidence turns up synagogue in Nazareth. So there's lots of things where skepticism often does get overturned increasingly by the best archaeology and that kind of thing. What you rarely find is archaeology contradicting the Bible, if you like. It always seems to go in the opposite direction.
Yeah. I was in Israel at the end of 2022, and that was the most astonishing thing was how much they kept finding to even things like the city of David, where they were like, oh, we don't really know if David was a real guy from history. And then, like, sure enough, right outside the Temple Mount, they find this elaborate city that they say is the city of David. We saw that same pool and walked to that location, which is relatively a modern excavation. So yeah, there's always stuff. So that to me is super interesting, is the archaeological evidence that seems to keep, to your point, proving and confirming aspects of the Bible.
And this is the big difference between something like Christianity and something like, say, Mormonism, which also has claims about history, but they can't provide any archaeological evidence of Jesus appearing to ancient tribes in South America or any of the kind of stories that you find in the Book of Mormon. And that's the huge difference, is it's kind of a lot more obvious when someone is kind of inventing something from whole cloth than when someone is placing their story in a very obvious historical framework. And this is the beauty for me of the Christian story. It's not just a set of moral precepts and commands. It's not something that was just given to someone in a vision. You know, it's not like Mormonism kind of basically comes out of Joseph Smith saying he discovered these writings on some golden tablets and so on. That's a very personal, you know, that's only he can kind of corroborate that. Muhammad, you know, he wrote the Quran from supposedly visitations from an angel. Again, there's no way of you corroborating any of that, because that's just someone's private angelic visitation.
The argument to corroborate that is, well, look at how magnificent the writings are. I started a debate on, I think Trent Horn is debating someone that's a Mormon, and the opening line is like, there's no way that the literary evidence of how great the Book of Mormon is written, there's no way this could be written by a man with a third grade education. You know,
the
and it's
problem
like,
is that's a very subjective standard that
Sure.
you're applying to that.
Right.
But the point is, unlike all those other religions and claims that are essentially based in personal experiences, Christianity is based on historical claims that were available to everyone at the time. Okay, if you wanted to show that these followers talking about a resurrected Messiah were false, you could have, if you had the body, you could have produced it. You know, there were lots of people around to contradict these historical claims that were being made by people. So it's the fact that Christianity is grounded in a time, place, specific arguments, specific claims about historical events, not some kind of vague spiritual, you know, I later discovered this in a revelation stuff. And that's what I love about Christianity. It's falsifiable in that sense. And that sounds like a bad thing, but actually an argument is only an argument if it's falsifiable. You could be wrong about it, okay? And because it's based in historical facts, you could be shown wrong. You know, if we dug up something that we could show was the body of Jesus, we'd all be wrong about Christianity, okay? But that's what I love about it. It is actually something where you say something happened, something really happened. People had access to this, could have been contradicted, but this movement flourished because actually it turned out stuff happened and people were reacting to it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. One of my favorite conversations I've seen you have is with Alex O'Connor. I believe you recently had him on for the launch of your book. You guys had a conversation, which was really cool. I also remember several years back, he had a conversation with a jet-lagged Frank Turek in studio. And I thought that went really well, but there was parts where they seemed like they were, I don't know, maybe misunderstanding each other. So Alex O'Connor had this conversation with Jordan Peterson, which for me was like, man, this is it, right? Like this is for Christians, we wanted these answers from Jordan, and Alex got them for us, which was, hey, if you had a time machine and a video camera, and we went back in time, and we went to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would we see a bodily risen Jesus coming out? And Jordan gave him the answer, which is yes. You know, he affirms the
On
bodily
balance,
resurrection.
he said, yeah, I think probably.
Yeah. What did he say? I suppose so, I think was the exact word, or something like that, which kind of shocks Alex. Alex is like,
okay,
this
isn't just a purely psychological Jungian symbolic thing. Okay.
because that's how people kind of hear Jordan Peterson talk about these things. Now, he then goes on to present the Gnostic Gospels as his thesis of, well, maybe maybe Jesus rose in the sense that the Gnostics believe, and that, you know, and he goes on and on about the Gnostics, and felt well knowing some of the outlandish claims in the Gnostics, like Jesus telling the apostles that I believe it was Mary would have to become a man
in order to
be saved. Like the ridiculous stuff in the Gnostic Gospels. It was debunked and called a heresy within the first century. Like what this is, and yet there's just this fascination. And a lot of my friends who've deconverted or deconstructed all of a sudden circle back to the Gnostics because it gives you this out of a bodily resurrection that has a radical implication on us. And Alex seems to be very intrigued and flirting with it. What do you make of all of that? And it to me, it just comes off like such a cliche thing that people go through. It's like they don't like the bodily resurrection, so they're like, well, maybe the Gnostics were onto something. And Jordan rightfully rebukes him. Dr. Peterson rightfully rebukes him and was like, no, like that. This isn't good. This isn't right. You know.
Well, I want to first of all say I'm friends with Alex, and I kind of got to know him again before his kind of meteoric rise to fame. He's now just, I think, celebrated at the time of recording 850,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel. So but I knew him when he was like a 16-year-old teenager in his bedroom, just kind of making kind of snarky response to Christian type videos. And it was actually him making a kind of snarky response to one of my videos that kind of actually led to me meeting him and bringing him on my show and having some great conversations. He's evolved an awful lot himself, actually. He kind of says he went through that kind of teenage Hitchens atheist phase. He's kind of past that. He went and did a theology degree at Oxford, for goodness sake. So he's actually really immersed himself in the best arguments for faith. He's actually got a lot of Christian friends around him now. And so I find that, and he will willingly kind of look back at some of his early videos and say, I was wrong. I was dismissive. I didn't understand that argument. So I think there's a lot of humility to Alex. I really like that about him. And I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've shared together. I also really appreciated him holding Jordan Peterson's feet to the fire and saying, look,
he did what we couldn't do.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, go Alex, when I heard him saying, look, just tell us what you think. Did it really happen? Because for me, it is important. I love Jordan Peterson's kind of the bigger picture. You know, I see an awful lot of symbolism and meaning in Scripture. I think he's done a fantastic service bringing that to the surface and helping people to just take Christianity seriously at an intellectual level. But I wanted to know the same thing as Alex. Look, when the rubber hits the road, did Jesus walk out of the tomb? Because that's the claim in Scripture, and that's what Paul says. If that didn't happen, our faith is worthless, it's futile, it's in vain. And so I was really intrigued, like you, to hear Jordan Peterson say, yeah, I think so. And for me, that's really important, actually, because you can have all the symbolism and psychology in the world. If Jesus didn't come back to life physically, that's the whole point. It's that this world, the material world of you and me, gets redeemed, restored, recreated by Jesus.
Amen.
He hasn't said goodbye to the physical world. He hasn't said, oh, this doesn't really matter. It's all about just thoughts in your head and kind of floating off to some heavenly place. Actually, God cares about this world, about the fact we're embodied human beings. That's why he became a human, okay?
Which blows the Gnosticism out of the water.
And that's the point.
The incarnation story is so
Gnostic
important.
version of Christianity was rejected as a heresy by the early church because it went back on that. It tried to roll that back. It basically got kind of corrupted by kind of basically a sort of the Greek ideas that actually the body's not good. You know, we don't like physicality. It's corrupt in some way. We just want to kind of live in this ethereal spiritual dimension. And so the Gnostics tried to separate again God from becoming physical and said, no, Jesus wasn't really a physical person. Maybe he kind of looked that way, but he was really just this heavenly thing. And no, Jesus didn't physically rise again. We don't like physical stuff. It was just a kind of spiritual thing. So yeah, there are those writings in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. You can find them. Alex has obviously discovered them recently. But the reason they're not in our Bible, the reason they're not alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is because they were wrong. Is because that was a heresy. That was a contradiction of what the first Christians claimed about Jesus. It was physical, okay? Why is Alex interested in this? I think, you know, to be fair to Alex, what he's trying to say, I think, is, oh, well, there were different versions of Christianity that came about, okay? Your version, Justin, isn't the only version that was going, okay? People came up with different ideas about the resurrection. And I want to say, yeah, and they always have. People have always come up with different ideas about Jesus. But let's remember what these Gnostic Gospels are. They're much later, okay? They're late and they're fake, basically. They're like fan fiction about Jesus, about 100 to 200 years later. What you have in your Gospels is the earliest accounts of Jesus' life. And that's why they're there, is because the early church said, they were kind of just trying to decide what's going to be the authoritative canon, if you like. And they had some of these Gnostic Gospels kind of as options. Some people liked them, but they said, no, that won't do. They're too late and they're fake. They don't go back to the sources. If you read them, you only have to go and read them, and you'll find that they talk about Jesus, but in very vague terms. They talk about the disciples, but in very vague terms. They don't put him in locations. They don't use history. They don't use the language, the terminology of the era. You can tell that they're written at a distance by people who don't really understand.
Yeah.
And that's why we don't trust them. And so it's fine. You can point to them and you can say, hey, people had different ideas about Christianity. That's always been the case. But we know that they're not to be trusted. And the early Christians knew they weren't to be trusted. That's why we didn't include them in the Bible.
Yeah, or as if there's not other books that weren't included in the Bible. Like I think of First Clement, I think of the Didache. There's a lot of other stuff that he could be flirting with.
The Shepherd of Hermes. I mean, there was lots of stuff going, and not all of it was bad. I mean,
some of these books is great.
Yeah, exactly. Some of these books were important parts of, you know, the way Christians started to understand their faith and have a rule of life and these kind of things. But they didn't all make it. Obviously, that they had to kind of decide, okay, well, what are we going to put as the deposit of faith, the thing we're going to pass on and say this is, and I think that was a needed process. And I don't mind. You know, I will read the Gnostics, and you might find some interesting stuff there, some helpful historical stuff. But I don't think that's what God gave us as kind of the authoritative account that he wanted to leave of who Jesus was and the difference he makes.
Yeah, I just find it interesting, the need or the seeming need to affirm books that give such an alternative version of who Jesus was, what he preached, and the claims of the incarnation and the resurrection. When there's books that weren't canonical, that were closer to the times of Jesus, that aren't as interesting to the skeptic.
Well, and there's a good reason, you know, why people kind of, things go viral, like some fragment of an early Gnostic gospel claiming Jesus had a wife. It's because people are kind of interested. They're titillated by that. It's different, isn't it? And obviously things like that often get disproved, as that fragment did. It was a forgery and everything else. But even if that was, you know, from the early centuries and so on, yeah, people kind of made this stuff up. There was this fan fiction going on. So it doesn't really make any bearing. The irony is that the reason we kind of run after some of these alternative theories and hypotheses about Jesus is because we're so used to the story of Jesus. And we think that's, oh, well, that's kind of boring. You know, that's why when Dan Brown, you know, writes the Da Vinci Code, it's like, exciting, an alternative theory. It was all a kind of cover up, and, you know, Jesus really did have a wife and all the rest of it. When in fact, actually, the most controversial sort of countercultural story of Jesus that's ever been written was the one that was written in the Gospels. Because it's just, we've become so familiar with it, we don't see how extraordinary, controversial and compelling it was. This claim that God had become human and had experienced the death of a rebel slave on a cross and then be raised to life. This was such a crazy, controversial claim in its day that Paul said, this is foolishness to the Gentiles, okay? Scandalous. It was completely out there, and yet this was what people said had happened. And I think we've lost that sense of just how extraordinarily scandalous and different and countercultural this story was, because it's kind of part of the fabric of our culture now. But I think we should go back to the original story.
Well, because we take it for granted.
Yeah.
We live in such a Christianized world that we take this. It's like, you know, it's like when you travel a lot, you could have these different delicacies and you can try these different foods and you can go to these different parts of the world. But I enjoy my wife's food the best. You know, like I enjoy home-cooked meals the best, the time with the family the best. And if you're not careful, you can quickly find the new novelty and the new thing and ignore the home and the good, you know? And I think that's kind of how like the Gospels are in Western culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, I think sometimes familiarity breeds contempt and like people chase after interesting new ideas and everything else. But actually, sometimes it's about Christians especially kind of approaching the Gospels kind of and maybe stripping away some of their cultural assumptions, getting behind the text. I found scholars like N.T. Wright so helpful in doing this, people who can kind of uncover a lot of what's going on around the Gospels that you may not get by just reading the Gospels, putting in its historical context, and suddenly it comes alive in a fresh way. You realize just how unusual this movement was. That's kind of what Tom Holland does as well in his book. He just kind of puts the finger on just how weird Christianity was in its day. You know, because today we say, well, of course, we should treat people equally. Men and women are equal. We should be compassionate, and so on. That's all kind of a given in our culture. It's only when you put those claims of the early Christians in its historical culture where you could basically treat some women as your sexual slaves. That was the right of a free Roman man to basically have sex with whoever he wanted of an inferior, male or female, of an inferior rank. You could leave your children, if they were unwanted, out on the roadside to be eaten by wild animals or picked up by foreigners, because that was just the culture of the day. Why do we think of that as abhorrent today? It's because we've been Christianized. It's because the Christians took those children in.
That's what I was going to say,
They, you know,
rescued
adopted
the babies,
them. They rescued them. It's because they said, no, it's not okay for you to have sex with whoever you want, whoever is your social inferior. We're going to say, if you're a man, you need to have one wife and you need to be faithful to her. That was absolutely crazy to the Romans. That was like, that went against all of their natural instincts as men. And yet this has become, faithfulness has become a kind of really important concept in Western culture. So I just think we need to recapture just how weird Christianity was in its first century context.
I love that. Okay. This to me was one of the craziest views that I found out that Alex, not just Alex, but Alex has openly spoken about. Richard Dawkins, I recently saw a video recently speak about. To me, this is what makes the atheist worldview completely incoherent to anyone who's reasonable. The idea that there is no free will. You can't, what is the saying Alex said? You can't, in his conversation with Ben Shapiro, you can want what you will, but you can't will what you will. Which is crazy to me.
Yeah.
The fact that people are incapable of changing their will, right? Yeah. To me, I go, how is that? Because you could have two different people who are both succumb to a really bad drug addiction, both experience some sort of trauma. One person turns it around and becomes an advocate and helps get people off of drugs by telling their story and working in that world. Another person succumbs to the addiction and overdoses. Yeah. You mean to tell me neither of those folks had control over their will? Like, that's a crazy, incoherent worldview to me. And so I don't understand how that's even possible, because both people, same situation, and one overdoses, one becomes an advocate for sobriety and helps change his community, right? Like, I think the idea of free will is so intrinsic to people and to who we are in our DNA that for the atheists to basically take a hyper-Calvinist position, right? Like the horseshoe theory, like the atheists and the hyper-Calvinists end up at the same conclusion.
They do. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? They come to kind of a similar conclusion.
Yeah, what do you make of that?
I mean, at least the Calvinist still has one free agent, and that's God, whereas the atheist just lives in a completely closed, deterministic universe.
Yes.
And I think the reason why someone like Alex or Richard Dawkins kind of basically subscribes to determinism, the idea that there's no free will in the universe, in you or me, is actually because it's a logical outworking of their materialist atheist perspective, okay? Because basically, if ultimately we live in a universe which is just about the laws of nature, atoms, electrons, we live in a universe of pure cause and effect. And there's no you deciding to go a different route, have something different for breakfast this morning. All that's happening is atoms and electrons doing what they do, okay?
You're a robot, basically, based on your biological wiring.
Exactly. And basically, the crazy thing for me, the weirdest thing about it is that if you wound back the universe to the Big Bang, like to the first point in time, to the exact same physical state, everything would happen in exactly the same way. We would be having the same conversation. Nothing would change. This is on the determinist view, okay? So it's like everything was set out from the very beginning. Like that no one has any control over anything that they do, say, or think. But for me, although that's logically consistent with the atheist worldview, it also completely undermines the atheist worldview. And that's why I don't buy it, okay? Because there's a few, I mean, at the first place, it completely obliterates the idea of morality, okay? That's the first casualty of determinism. Because, like you said, if there's someone who turns their life around, perhaps they've had an addiction, but they become this person who helps other people to escape it, there's no point saying, what a great person, we should praise them, we should give them some kind of an award, because they didn't decide to do that. It's just the chemistry working out. No one deserves any praise or any blame.
There's no virtue, essentially.
There's no virtue.
There's no value,
Why are we sending people to prison for doing bad things? They couldn't help it.
It
was just their chemistry. It was just the way things worked out. So the whole idea of punishing people seems completely absurd on this view. So, but at the same time, we're like, no, but we live in a world where, of course, we have to acknowledge good and evil, right and wrong. And so that's the first thing. Is like, okay, how do we even make sense of a world in which those categories no longer exist? Okay, so that's the first thing you deal with. But then even more for me, corrosive and kind of completely undercutting the whole project is the fact that reason itself, the thing that so many atheists pride themselves on, reason and evidence, that's why I'm an atheist, that goes out the window as well. Because if all your thoughts in your brain, Ruslan, right now, are not the result of you weighing different arguments and coming to reasonable conclusions and working out what the best thing to believe is, if actually all the thoughts in your brain are the result of chemical reactions, which you have no control over, which were always going to be the way they are, then the fact that your brain fizzes one way and you're a Christian, and Alex's brain fizzes another way and he's an atheist, that's something neither of you have any control over. It's just the way it was always going to be. And so that means there's no reasons. There's no logic. There's no kind of intellectual pursuit going on here. There's just the deterministic outworking of the atoms and electrons in both your brains. Okay. So reason doesn't exist. But then you're like, okay, well, if reason doesn't exist, then why do I believe what I believe? I believe it just because of a completely kind of abstract, non-purposive set of reactions that have kind of go back to the beginning of time. Well, if that's the case, why should you believe what you believe? You had no say in that. You have no reason to believe in that. All that's happening is atoms and electrons kind of producing thoughts in your brain. And so the whole thing suddenly tumbles down because you've kind of, it's like by claiming that we live in this deterministic universe, it's like you're soaring off the branch that you're sitting on because you can no longer trust reason any longer. And C.S. Lewis, I think, brilliantly pointed this out in a book called Miracles, where he kind of realized that if we live in this completely materialistic, deterministic universe, you can no longer believe in reason. It just evaporates. And that's the great irony of someone like Alex, for me, saying, I'm a reasonable atheist, is that if you're a determinist at the same time, reason goes out the window. There's no such thing. And I struggle to see why more atheists don't see this. I've had a few conversations, even one with another well-known atheist YouTuber who's called Rationality Rules, Stephen Woodford. We kind of had a debate at Oxford University in which this came up, and literally his channel is called Rationality Rules. And I said, you believe in rationality, but you're a determinist. You can't have them both. Okay, you can't have one with the other. So I find this, like you, a completely incoherent philosophical worldview because you don't get morality and you don't get reason, and those are the two things that most atheists are really concerned about.
Okay, so having said all that, which again makes it very linear and coherent and reasonable and rational, do you think Alex will eventually come to Jesus? If he's truly as reasonable and rational as he leads himself on.
Lots of people have been talking about Alex coming to Christ because so often he does seem so open. As I said, he's done a theology degree. He's surrounded himself with Christians. He has a very different tone when he's talking about faith. And I think he's really come to appreciate the value of Christianity as well. I think he's, to some extent, been persuaded, actually, that a purely atheistic account of reality doesn't ultimately, for a lot of people, give them the story.
He likes the fruit of Christianity.
Yeah, I think to some extent he does. I don't know whether he goes the whole way with the Tom Holland thesis, but nonetheless. So I think he's kind of, he went through his kind of Christopher Hitchens, religion poisons everything phase, and he's kind of moved well beyond that. But at the same time, when I've asked Alex this question, he says, well, look, I may be more open and sympathetic to Christianity, but I'm still nowhere near being a Christian, he says. Okay. And one of his main issues is still he struggles with the problem of evil. Okay. And that's one of the significant objections he has to God. And I understand that. For me, this is where kind of, as a Christian, I don't tend to turn just to a purely logical argument to answer that. I turn to the person of Jesus. For me, that's critical. And you've got to engage kind of with the person of Jesus to understand that the way Christianity answers the problem of suffering and evil is that God entered into it and kind of took it upon himself. And that's something more mysterious than just an intellectual argument about it. So I don't know what it would take for Alex to get there, in all honesty. I'm really glad. I see him, interestingly, rather like Jordan Peterson, as one of these people who's actually helping people think about it, though. I'd rather he was there as an atheist asking these interesting questions than he just wasn't interested at all. So, you know, I don't know how Alex will respond to this if he sees this, but I almost see God using Alex, even as an atheist, to kind of encourage people to think about this and take this seriously. I think probably Alex has probably been part of the conversion of more people than he realizes. And who knows, it might happen to him.
I think it very well may happen to him, especially on the other side of eventually having a family and kids and just that season of life, which I'm sure eventually he'll really, it'll really help him think through things. But here's my next question to you was going to be, hearing the best arguments from atheists. Like, what do you think is the best argument against God? You mentioned the problem of evil, which I think is an interesting one. As someone who has up until probably the age of 14, 15, had a pretty rough life, experiencing sexual assault multiple times as a child, experiencing dad not being in my life and being arrested and trying drugs and all those different things. That was my initial reason for not coming to God, was like, man, if there's a God, he definitely doesn't like me, so why would I want anything to do with the God? And now being on the other side, I relate much more to the passage in Genesis, I think 50:20, where Joseph says, that which you meant for evil, God used for good. And to your point, some may argue that Joseph is a type of Christ, foreshadowing, right? Being sold by his brothers, almost losing his life, sold into slavery, and then sits at the right hand of Pharaoh. So the problem of evil, to me, obviously there's the cross, but then there's my own personal experience of like, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't be the husband, father that I am today. And I still deal with remnants of stuff from my childhood and the sin that was done against me, the evil that was done against me. But on the other side of it, I don't think I would change anything. My dad not being in my life, my mom being an alcoholic, experiencing sexual assault, getting arrested as a kid. And so I think, to me, like, the problem of evil, like, yes, I hear that. And granted, there's way more evil experiences people have than I had. But it's in God's incredible mercy and sovereignty and providence, somehow it seems like he consistently makes beautiful things out of the worst tragedies. And not always on this side of eternity, sometimes on the other side of eternity. And so I think, would you say that's the best argument you've heard against God?
I would, yeah. I mean, I think it is the biggest objection to God. It's the oldest objection to God. You go back to the oldest book in the Bible, Job, it's about the problem of suffering and evil. And it's the one I find most consistently. And I think you encounter it in lots of different ways, but ultimately it comes back to this question: why would a good, all-powerful God allow the amount of suffering and evil I see in the world or just in my own life? And the reason I think this is such a powerful objection, or seems to be such a powerful objection to God, is that it's not just a kind of an intellectual argument. It's a personal one. People encounter this when they go through tragedy and suffering. And I often see kind of, as you say, two different ways that impacts people. I often see a lot of people who turn away from God, kind of as you did in your early life, said, if I can't believe in a God who would allow me to go through this, or who would allow that to happen. But I also see a different reaction. Sometimes I see people actually cling on to God harder in the midst of suffering. And that's because they can't make sense of life and their suffering in the absence of God. So there's actually two different ways in which and that's kind of the story of Job, really. Some people telling him, just curse God and kind of give up on God. And him saying, no, even in the midst of everything, I'm still going to hold on to God, kind of thing. And for me, I think there are some helpful intellectual arguments, what are sometimes technically called theodicies, ways of thinking about why God would allow a world where suffering and evil and bad things happen to good people, how that could work within his divine providence, his bigger purpose. A lot of the time when an atheist, maybe like Alex, brings up the problem of suffering and evil, they're kind of doing a calculation. They're saying, wouldn't it be better if there was just a bit less suffering in the world? And God surely can do that. God can surely make a world in which this stuff didn't happen, And just on the balance of just the level of suffering and so on, it makes sense not to believe that there's actually a God behind it. But I think that fails to take into account that we cannot see things from God's perspective. And we kind of do this kind of simple arithmetic and calculation about the level of suffering versus the level of good. And we think, well, this much suffering means God can't exist. Actually, I don't think we're ever in a position to know the bigger picture that God has. I mean, one example I use in a very minor way, when we had our third child born, Jeremy, and we had some complications at the time he was born. He was born with a skin infection. And so within 24 hours of his birth, I had to go down to the ICU and help a doctor to inject a kind of a needle into his tiny little wrist to deliver the antibiotics that he needed to make sure that it flushed out this infection so that he could, be healthy. But it was a horrible business, and he was crying, and I was having to kind of try and feed him these little sugary droplets of water to kind of keep him calm while the doctor tried to find a vein. And I wished I could have got down to his level and said, the doctor doesn't hate you. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help you. But you cannot see this from your baby perspective. All you feel is the pain and the suffering in this moment. And I think we're like the baby. We don't see the eternal perspective of God. We cannot see it. Maybe we will never see it because we'll never be God, okay? But I do believe that actually God has a perspective that would make sense of all of our questions in the end. Now, there are some ways we can see that. Just in everyday life, we can see the way in which actually a lot of the suffering and evil that exists in the world is actually down to the misuse of our human freedom, okay? There's a lot of stuff that happens in the world is because people lie, cheat, and kill each other. And the question is, should God always step in to kind of stop that happening? Well, the problem is, of course, if God always intervened, we would just become robots, puppets. We wouldn't have free will. And the question is, well, what's the problem with that? Well, then we wouldn't be human. We wouldn't be able to love. We wouldn't be able to do all the things that freedom entails. So the gift of freedom, which is kind of what makes us human, makes life worth living, also entails that we've got the possibility of misusing that freedom. So I think there's a kind of payoff almost in being human. And God gives us his freedom, but it comes with this cost that actually we're going to misuse that freedom. The good news is that God comes to kind of intervene in our mistakes. That's why he comes in Jesus, to put right the things that we've put wrong. But even on top of that, people sometimes point to like natural evil. Okay, so there are some things that don't seem to be down to human misuse of their freedom. Earthquakes, illness, those kinds of natural disasters. And I think at that point, I have to turn to kind of the bigger picture and say, well, it's not just that humans are misusing their free will. It's that we live in a kind of a broken universe. There's this thing called the fall that's described in the Bible, and it's this idea that humans kind of rebelled against God. There's even this kind of hint of an angelic rebellion against God, that the whole of creation has kind of gone out of kilter because it's kind of rebelled against God. And so when you look at it in that big cosmic perspective, I want to say, I acknowledge there are some things that just seem so absurd and sad and tragic, earthquakes and illness that affect people, which we don't seem to have any control over. But I think that's a factor of the fact we live in this broken universe. And we live in a world that's at one level beautiful. You can see the design and the purpose, but you can also see the defects and the fact that the same purpose, the same kind of tectonic activity that brings minerals to the surface of the earth to refresh it are also responsible for earthquakes. The same kind of cell activity that kind of means our body is healthy and can grow properly. When mutations happen, it causes cancer. It's like it's this beautiful but broken world that we're living in this tension. And I think that's what Scripture describes. We live in this kind of what Paul calls the groaning of creation. It's kind of, it's waiting to be set free from its bondage to decay.
That's good.
And that's what, so we're living in a kind of spiritual war zone. And I have to say, like, okay, this means I can't give you just some kind of purely logical, intellectual answer. I have to ask you to step into the worldview of Christianity and say we live in this beautiful and broken universe, and that's why there is this battle of evil and suffering. But we haven't been left on our own. Jesus has come and done something about it, and this is the wonderful story of Christianity. God didn't stand off and leave us to kind of mess up ourselves and the world to kind of mess us up as well. He said, I'm going to come in person, and he suffered evil, suffering. He suffered death, everything that kind of we were responsible for. And he overcame it. The resurrection is the sign that God's going to completely redeem, restore, and renew the world. And that hasn't happened in its fullness yet. But we've kind of been given the first taste of it. The first, if you like, the first battle in the war has been won in Jesus' resurrection. And we are invited in this broken world, with all our own brokenness, to join in God's redemption and restoration of this world by kind of saying, I'm joining this movement.
Amen.
And I'm going to be part of the answer to this. And I'm probably going to suffer a lot. We're promised that, actually, as followers of Jesus. But actually, it's worth it, because actually, I'd rather live in the tension of the mystery of suffering than the other option, which is not believing in God, discarding God. That doesn't get rid of suffering and evil. It just makes it meaningless. It means there's no rhyme or reason to any of it. And I'd rather live in the kind of the mystery of what God's doing in and through the world and us, through Jesus. Because that at least gives me a sense that actually God's gonna bring it right. There's gonna be a meaning behind this in the end. Even if I can't see it now, I believe there's gonna be a purpose to all of this. And I've got more hope in this way of looking at the world than I think I could ever have in the kind of the rejecting God one.
I love that. That's beautiful. Kind of bringing the conversation full circle, your book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. We've covered Joe Rogan extensively, his fascination with this God, Jesus, Christianity thing. My first question to that is what do you make of that? Connecting it to Jordan Peterson, connecting it to Tom Holland, connecting it to these other people that you're exploring in your book. What do you make of Joe Rogan in that? And the second question is, do you think we're on the verge of revival, or do you think this is all just kind of consumeristic, tabloid, points that I'm making and where we're seeing?
Well, I was probably as surprised as you when I saw Joe Rogan saying, looks like we need Jesus, basically. And I think what Joe Rogan is seeing, and a lot of people are seeing, is that the culture is going off in some pretty crazy directions. Directions that the new atheists kind of didn't anticipate and realize. And I think what a lot of people are realizing is that we're story-driven creatures. And once you kind of get rid of the Christian story, like I said, it's not that we live in some kind of rational utopia. People need a story. They need something quasi-religious to believe in. And so they're bringing in all these other ones. And I think what Joe Rogan and a lot of secular intellectuals are realizing is that the story people are replacing Christianity with is a very individualistic, personal story. Often on the progressive left, it's about sexuality and gender and identity. And those become kind of people's new religion. That becomes like the thing you cannot question. You become a heretic even.
They got their own dogmas, their own sacraments.
Yeah, you've got rituals, you've got certain, types of, banners, rainbow banners, whatever it is. It kind of becomes quasi-religious because people dedicate their life to that. Because we have to have something to make sense of our life. And a lot of people invest their meaning, their identity in that thing. And you do get your heretics like J.K. Rowling. If she suddenly says, actually, I'm not sure this transgender thing is such a good idea, she becomes a social pariah because that's the new religion. That's the new Puritanism. That's the new kind of in and out group. And even people like Richard Dawkins, suddenly he gets, because he starts to have concerns about transgender, for instance, he gets cancelled by his own atheist group. The American Humanist Association rescinded his Humanist of the Year award that they gave him because he kind of, started critiquing transgender from a bio. So all kinds of interesting things are happening. And I think a lot of people like Joe Rogan and even Richard Dawkins and others are realizing, it turns out that if you just get rid of Christianity, all that happens is people turn to all kinds of other mythologies, essentially, things to try and make sense of their life. They don't turn to just biology and science and reason. And so I think that's what's happening. And that's why Joe Rogan has suddenly kind of perked up and said, okay, maybe we were too quick to dismiss this Christian story. Maybe we need to look again at this story and the way it's shaped our culture. That's why he's talking to Jordan Peterson. That's why he's bringing on some of these people who are talking about Jesus again. And I see this happening to lots of people. We talked about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the way it's happened to her. Tom Holland, the historian, Douglas Murray, people kind of just recognizing. And I see people jumping in, to this story and realizing it's not good enough to simply wish that we had some of the fruits of Christianity any longer. I've realized the only way I can make sense of that story is if I investigate it, and some people are finding it's true. So I had a fascinating conversation with someone called Paul Kingsnorth, who's a celebrated British writer and poet. And he kind of has a really interesting backstory of bouncing around from kind of teenage atheism to becoming a Buddhist for many years, but finding that he loved nature. He loved being out in the woods and the mountains. He wanted to worship something, he said. So he became a Wiccan. He became like going out in the woods, doing nature worship rituals. In the end, he says he kind of found it was actually a kind of pastiche of sort of esoteric 60s New Age stuff and what he eventually thought was Christian heresies, basically, kind of all molded together.
So he didn't come to the conclusion that he's actually dabbling in witchcraft and demonic stuff?
He says there was definitely a spiritual component to it. And that's what he came to realize as well, actually. In fact, he says Jesus kind of had to drag him out of Wicca in the end, and he came to realize
very common and prevalent right now. The overlap
yeah.
between witches, New Age, and all that stuff, and many of them coming to Christ.
Absolutely. So he's a classic example of this. What happened to him? He says, so he only converted about 3 or 4 years ago to Christianity. This is an adult thinking, very successful, author and poet. And he said he was the most surprised of anyone that he became a Christian. But he says what happened was he started to have dreams about Jesus. He started he ran a writing school, and suddenly all these kind of vicars and church leaders started sending him their sermons. People he had never thought were Christians turned out to be Christians. Even his wife, not a Christian, said to him over dinner one day, "You're going to become a Christian." She kind of prophesied it. And he said, "Don't be ridiculous." But it happened. And it happened because he started to investigate the story again. He kind of felt drawn towards it. And he realized what he'd rejected in his kind of teenage years, he hadn't really understood. And when he went and looked at it again, he found there was this compelling story that made sense of all these other stories he'd been trying to find meaning and purpose and identity in. And I just feel like if it can happen to Paul Kingsnorth, it could happen to anyone. I just see lots more people who have tried all the other stories. Maybe it's the progressive left sexuality, gender story, and they're coming up empty. They find themselves depressed, anxious. They're living in this world of constant demands on them, and they can never satisfy them. It's a very religious world in all the wrong ways, puritanical, cancels you if you get it wrong. It might be kind of mythologies of the right. I'm going to invest my faith in some kind of political figure. But the problem is all of these stories aren't what people are actually looking for. They're kind of sub-stories. People are looking for the story of God and Jesus in the end, and none of these other things will satisfy them. So I think we're kind of getting to a point where we've applied a lot of science, a lot of technology. We're kind of more materially prosperous than ever before, and yet we're more depressed than ever before. We have this mental health crisis on our hands among young people. It turns out the more we pump in of our own, science and ideas and secularism, the worse we make things for ourselves. Our ancestors were materially much worse off. They didn't understand as much about the world scientifically, but they were happier, it turns out. They were more kind of in tune with things. And I just think people like Joe Rogan are suddenly realizing we need a different solution. We're just pumping in more of the same thing isn't going to work. And that's why they're investigating ancient wisdom. A huge boom in people kind of talking about, the ancient philosophers and Stoicism and all that kind of thing. But I think what a lot of people are finding is the person who made the most sense in the ancient world was actually Jesus Christ. And that's why you're finding people like Joe Rogan opening up to it.
On the cusp of revival, do you think we are?
I hesitate to use the word revival. Because
awakening. How about great awakening?
Awakening, maybe.
Yeah.
I think as a Christian, I believe God always works in kind of cycles. And there's a poem I quote at the beginning of my book and the podcast series that accompanies it, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is called Dover Beach. And it's written by this Victorian poet, Matthew Arnold. And it has this famous line about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. This idea that faith is just going out on the west as science and secularism come in to replace it. But it was actually in a conversation with Douglas Murray that he said to me, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And I think what we're seeing is a kind of turning of the tide in the West.
Yeah.
Now, you can call that a revival. You can call it an awakening. All I know is that the ground's been laid for people to be ready to hear the Christian story again, because they're fed up. They're exhausted by the stories they're currently telling themselves. And that's why I see the rise of people like Jordan Peterson suddenly becoming popular, pointing people back towards the Bible. And I think we're just ready to hear that. Now, that might go off in all kinds of strange directions. I'm not saying everything that's happening in this is of God, but I think the church, Christians, need to be ready to lean into this and say, there's a lot of people looking for a better story to make sense of their life. Are we ready to tell that story again, creatively, compellingly to them? And I think we've got an amazing opportunity to do that. And I do see it bubbling up from the ground. It's not just at these intellectual level that this is happening. I think there's a generation, Gen Z, desperate for a better story. They're just spiritually hungry and thirsty. You've seen things like the Asbury Awakening, a very much a Gen Z-led kind of revival. And I think the reason for that is that they're fed up with what they're being offered in the culture. They need more.
Yes.
And I've seen pockets of that kind of rising up in young people in the UK, in other parts of the world. I recently spoke to a student worker in the UK. They work across multiple campuses in the UK. And he said they've never seen more openness to the gospel right now in the last few years. Basically, if you invited a young person right now on a UK campus to church, they'd be very likely to say yes.
Wow.
People are turning up to church without being invited. He had a story about someone who had like a Bible verse printed on their T-shirt, and they were walking across campus, and they approached him and said, "Oh, like your verse, are you a Christian?" And they said, No, I've just been watching some videos. I realized I really need to read the Bible. I bought a Bible. This verse really stuck out for me, so I got it printed on a T-shirt. And this guy wasn't even a Christian, but like they said, that stuff is happening. And I just find that really exciting. Something's happening in the culture. People are ready to listen again.
Amen. Amen. All right. Well, guys, that's a great segue to our Patreon exclusive segment. I want to get more into what's going on in the UK with all these protests / riots, what they're doing in terms of being on the cutting edge of banning puberty blockers, with the building of the 10,000 new mosques and Islam infiltrating the culture. So meet us over on Patreon. This is going to be a bit too spicy for YouTube. If you want to see the full extended conversation, meet us over there. Parts of Europe and specifically the UK are starting to buckle down and saying, hey, nope, the research isn't as clear cut that this actually helps. It can seem to harm.
What was happening, of course, in the culture was that social media was basically fueling a kind of early onset dysphoria. Just huge numbers of young people suddenly saying, well, I'm transgender, I'm non-binary or whatever. Gangs of men, primarily Muslim, were essentially preying upon young, vulnerable women and essentially getting them into prostitution. But it's extraordinary. The number of Muslims around the world who are converting is off the chart.
Is it true that there's now 10,000 new mosques being built and churches are shutting down and these things are like, you can't just give kids puberty blockers like they're candy? There seems to be a shift. Do you think America will learn from you guys?
Ruslan